لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله لا إله إلا الله.
There's two kinds of meditations. Um, there's the inner state of meditation, right? That if we understand what that is, a lot of Islamic practices, of course, other spiritual practices, but a lot of the contemplative practices of Islam are involved in that state. Like that's one of the effects, if you will, of a lot of ibadat, which are fard and also are the sunnah, meaning the meditative state naturally arises when, for example, we listen to the adhan, which is a sunnah. One is supposed to be silent and listening to the adhan. So that's actually a sunnah, a strong sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. He always did this, or the majority of the time he did this, and it becomes something that's known. But what's not known is that that is a form of meditation practice, right? So that's just one example, very documented. Another example is that when the Prophet ﷺ, he he did his ablution, he was entirely silent and entirely present for the water of the ablution touching his body and his hands and his blessed body and the limbs of his body, sallallahu alaihi wasallam. And so much so that that silence, him remaining silent and not speaking during ablution, becomes a recommended sunnah, right? So it's and kind of one knows its effect when we do this. We can contemplatively feel, we can witness the falling away of sins and a kind of blessing that flows very literally and spiritually, symbolically. So these are two examples of ordinary practices, right? Of Muslims that are actually not only meditation practices as a form of practice, but engender or open one to the meditative state, right? But people don't realize this, that if they tap into that, that's what will happen. When Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala states in Surah al-Mu'minun, the surah of the believers, قد أفلح المؤمنون, as it starts and it moves on and it speaks of that word khushu or khashi'un, which is the Arabic for the plural, right? In this context, is it's a hard to translate word because it means someone who, while they pray the ritual prayer, are in contemplative presence, right? Are in contemplative humility, express humility on the body, express presence on the body. All these words can be used, are in a state of meditation while they're praying. All these words can actually be used for khashi'un, right? For those who have, who are humbled in their form. The emphasis here in this context, according to the Mufassirin, excuse me, is is bodily khushu, but that presupposes internal, right? That your body can't be supple in prayer if you are not stilled enough. So it's for the Sufi fuqaha, if you will. I mean, if I'm kind of just clumping, kind of phrases. For those knowers who are steeped in the Sufi and the Islamic traditions, they would understand that in the khushu of the body, it's already implicit or just implied, like anyone would understand that it meant that if you're being submissive and humble in your body posture, it implies an internal submissiveness, an internal humility, right? There's even verses which speak of also the khashya of the heart, right? So these are internal states, but then manifested or embodied as upon the body in ritual prayer. So these are prime examples, right, of the practice and the state. So both of them actually of meditation. There's explicit references to silence by the Prophet ﷺ in the hadith. That kind of a well-known hadith is that the believer is one who says beautiful things or good things when they speak, and if they do not have anything good to say, they should remain silent, They should keep their silence. Like that's the literal of the Arabic. They should keep their silence. Here, it's implied actually that the default state of the believer is silence, right? So in early Sufism, in early Islam, even to before Sufism became a term, right? You had the Tabi'een, you had the Salaf al-Salihin, the righteous predecessors, emphasizing silence in samt. So this word in Arabic, the practice of silence was considered a strong sunnah, to practice silence, to engage in fasting and silence. They were considered two separate acts, which were recognized to be one act in the followers of other religions, actually. So say that Maryam, when she secluded herself, her fasting was seclusion and silence and prayer and fasting. So all of this was part of her fast, to seclude herself, to be in khalwa, and to be fasting and to be silent, right? When Sayyidina Zakaria received word that he would have an inheritor, after asking, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, he was told to fast, to do the fast of silence. So these were contemplative practices, ibadat as contemplative practices in prior, which is recorded in the Quran, as a contemplative practice of prior prophets and the righteous of those traditions, not only praying at night and reciting revelations, which is also a practice of the people of the book, right? Which here, especially when done as a night vigil, is done in silence with usually a candlelight in the dark of the night, reciting very subtly the revelation and contemplating upon it and praying with it. All of that is a meditation practice. And then we come to the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu Alaihi Wasallam, right? Who, as you mentioned, very rightfully, he on the cave Hira, in the cave Hira where he received revelation, what was the context of him receiving the first revelation? The context is actually days and nights of deep solitude and meditation, right? And I kind of bring all this out in that chapter on is there a meditation or is there an Islamic meditation? And so in this context, then I bring out these 4 terms that the early, like the proto-Sufis in the Islamic tradition used. Let alone the Sufis, these 4, you could call them spiritual practices, or what Ibn Arabi later calls the pillars of spirituality, but actually that term was used, or like the arkan of ruhaniyat, or there's another word like riyadat, right? Spiritual exercise. So the pillars of spiritual exercises were these 4, and they were always understood to be that which was done by the communities prior to the coming of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu and the Hunafa in the time of the Prophet Sallallahu, the Hunafa, who performed the tahannuf practices, which were contemplative and meditative practices. There's no authoritative source that speaks about the exact details of these practices, but we know they entered 4 categories. So those categories are, number 1, solitude. Number 2, silence. Number 3, hunger or fasting. Number 4, wakefulness, especially at night. And they all have, Arabic words, right? In uzla, samt, ju'a, which means, hunger, right? And yaqadha, yaqaza, or one could even take that out and use a word that was then later used for this, Muraqaba. But yaqaza here, wakefulness, is a physical wakefulness, along with a spiritual or contemplative wakefulness, which was for those early predecessors, the Salaf Salih, who practiced zuhud in early Islam. And so these were the 4 spiritual practices. These are all contemplative practices. So that meant to stay up at night and be remembering Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in silence, in wakefulness, right? And so the tradition, especially, it culminates So Abu Talib al-Makki becomes like the watershed moment intellectually, spiritually. You can call him a proto-Sufi, right? He was not affiliated with an official order, but he was among those early kind of Muslims in the early generations who absorbed the spirituality of early Islam, and he began to codify it, kind of in a book, right, called Qut al-Qulub, the nourishment of the hearts, right, food of the hearts, the nourishment of the hearts, right? And and the and in this, it's considered now an early Sufi book, but it's not even a Sufi book. But what it is an amazing text that's very confusing. Like you have to be able to decode these things. They're really amazing. My Arabic is more elementary, but I've sat with my own students, my murids, who are very well versed in Arabic, and they would read me the passages, and they would try to do the translation, and then I would help them, and I would give them insights, and then they would realize that that is the word that's actually being used if I were to properly kind of translate it from the Arabic into English, which kind of showed a synchronicity of the contemplative spirit. So I knew where he was coming from when he was saying what he was saying. And so what he does is, in a very genius move, he has a whole book where he just speaks of the Prophet Muhammad Sallallahu, his sunnah, and the sunnah, or the actions of those around him who were steeped in spirituality, from Imam Ali to Abu Dhar al-Khifari and to others, and their practices, which go back to the sunnah of the Prophet Sallallahu. And he was able to he organized these into categories of practices that the Prophet ﷺ did, contemplative practices, and then also their timings. So he would have chapters where he would speak of their timings, where there's not, I mean, by the hadiths that he shows, there's not even an hour that goes by that one can implement a sunnah of the Prophet ﷺ. That's a contemplative practice. Like, that's how amazing the life of the Prophet ﷺ was, and how it was practiced. So then you have this big book like this, and only later in the text does he unfold the spiritual meanings of prayer and these things, or just prayer and like meaning the ritual prayer. So he spends half the text preparing from a spiritual perspective what the sunnah is in terms of contemplation. And then he gets to like halfway, this is it's a very big book. Halfway into it, he then starts speaking about ritual prayer. So it's not an ordinary fiqh manual, right? It's not a fiqh manual where you're learning how to pray. You're learning the backdrop or the background, the context spiritually of what's happening, and then how do you embody that realization in ritual prayer. That's the insight he had. So what's amazing about that is that as I was writing one of my books, this is exactly what I did, where I put the ritual prayer at the end, where in one section, and in terms of how I teach it, we speak about spirituality, and then how to embody that spirituality. And that's where the ritual prayer comes in. And if you look carefully, this is kind of how it happened in the seerah of the Prophet ﷺ, where you have the Meccan period, and then you have the Medina period, where the Medina period is the embodied spirituality that turns into the Sharia as we know it, right? The praying 5 times a day, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, right? But before that were 10 years of deep iman and spirituality, right? A separation from society, of praying at night. So the order for the night vigil was given in this time. In fact, in terms of the seerah, at a time where the ritual prayer was not revealed as a formal practice, actually. Because when does that happen? This happens, it's sealed by the Isra and the Mi'raj. So all these things are happening before the Isra and the Mi'raj, right? Which, of course, as we know, is right before the Hijrah, right? So you have, if you look at the seerah, the life story of the Prophet ﷺ, you have all these contemplative practices happening, and the order to do tahajjud, to stand up at night, right? A third of the night, or a little less, or a little more, and recite the revelations of God. And as Surah Muzammil says at the end of it, to devote yourself to the name of God, right? To use the name of God, Ism Allah or Ism Rabbik, and devote yourself wholeheartedly to Him. Now, in the Arabic, it could be to Him, meaning Allah, or it could be to it, meaning the name of Allah. And so it makes sense that a subtle practice in this time was standing and reciting verses and sitting and reciting verses, but standing at night, there's no official prayer yet. So there's no ruku and all of this. If it was done, it was done by inspiration, but it was not sanctioned by revelation yet. You can try to fact check me on that. Like, that's fine. I'm interested in being corrected if I'm mistaken, right? And so anyone can, so it was not instituted. It was not a prophetic institution yet, right? In terms of the prayers, there's ikhtilaf on this matter, that maybe some of the sunan and these things, there were sunan, so the structure was there, but the prayer itself was not fully instituted until at-tahiyatu lillahi comes. That's the setting final portion of the prayer. That happens in the Isra and Miraj. It doesn't happen before that. So whatever's going on, it doesn't have a tahiyatu in it. It doesn't have the jalus in position with the recitation that we know, that is authoritatively sanctioned by revelation and by prophecy, right? So what's happening, right? So it's open. So therefore there's ikhtilaf, there's differences of opinion of those who know, of the ulama and the fuqaha, in this time period. And my theory on this, right? And you can say an educated perspective on this, right? It's a perspective, is that there were stances that were inspired and even sitting positions, but all of these were simply inspired meditations that were accepted. And at the same time, there was recitation of the Quran, which could be done standing or sitting, perhaps even in prostration, as that is implied by some of the verses of the people of the book, who, when they listen to the revelations, they prostrate. So all of these possibilities are there, that there was a dynamic of how one's body embodied the recitation of the Quran itself. And then we have the Ism of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, where this verse is a commandment to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam to actually invoke his name wholeheartedly at night, in tahajjud, right? And to devote yourself to God wholeheartedly at night, or rather to God by view of the name of Allah, by the name of God at night. So I would even argue the invocation of the supreme name occurred here. Allahu Ta'ala Alam. This is an educated position. What I just have given you, I'm not a scholar of the religion in this particular way, but from my modest research, one cannot deny the possibility, or to reject it, that this is not a possibility, right? So all of these are contemplative practices, right? So from silent meditation to just simply practicing silence, right? Not speaking much, to fasting, feeling hunger as a contemplative practice, and feeling one's kind of need of God, right? Being in solitude. All of these are practices, reciting the revelations of God, contemplating deeply their meanings, implementing those meanings, but first contemplating them as there was an active reception of revelation. The Sahaba, the companions, were listening. They were listening and watchful presence, as the Prophet's own soul was to the revelation. All of that is meditation. All of that is a mode of contemplation. And so you can see there's a deep-rooted spirituality and listen with presence as a witness. This is a verse. It's all part of that same verse that I use a lot. Actually, I've used it a lot in the Mudhakkarat and the other things. But it points again to that the Dhikr here in this verse refers to revelation. This is the Quranic revelation meant to be a remembrance of something that's deep inside of you. And so therefore it's meant for someone who has a heart. Everyone has a heart. So what does God mean, who has a heart? The implication is an awakened heart, a contemplative heart, a heart opened by faith, right? A present heart. It means all those things when Allah says, for those who have a heart, because everyone has a heart. So he's singling out subhanahu wa ta'ala the heart for those who have a heart. If he were to say for those who have eyes, because they're looking with their eyes, the active eye, or those who have ears, who are lending an ear. Here he says heart. The one whose heart, the one who is present with their heart. This is what who has a heart means. You possess your heart when you're present with it. That's meditation, in Islam.
لا إله إلا الله 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 لا إله إلا الله